and welcome to the Outlook Study webinar. My name is Shamsia Qureshi and I'm the Manager of Research, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. The Outlook Study is our flagship report, and along with the data visualization tool, it provides you with some valuable information on the health of our industry, current trends, and where we are headed as a sector. I have an impressive lineup of panelists to unpack all the information for you today, starting with our very own JF Champagne, who I believe also has a message for our sponsors. JF?
Thank you very much, Shamsia. And I would like to welcome you all again to this webinar on the Outlook Study and acknowledge the financial contributions of our sponsors who make the production of reports such as the Outlook Study possible. Again, without your support, this would not be possible, and we'd like to continue to thank you for your ongoing support. Shamsia?
Thank you, JF. And we'll move to our next panelist, Todd Campau, all the way from the US.
Thank you, Shamsia. I'd like to thank AIA Canada and the sponsors for the opportunity to be here to share a little bit today. I have been in the aftermarket industry in the Americas for a little bit over 22 years now, so very excited to share some of the insights that we have today. And again, thanks for inviting me, Shamsia.
It's our pleasure to have you, Todd. Moving along, we have Mauricio, a lead researcher from Ernst & Young, who works on the Outlook Study. Mauricio, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shamsia. Pleasure to be here. My name is Mauricio Zelaya. I'm a partner and I lead the economic advisory practice for AIA Canada, based out of Toronto. And I've been working very closely with AIA for a number of years, developing these Outlook studies. So thank you very much to the sponsors, and also hopefully you enjoy this webinar.
Awesome. So let's jump right into what the data has to tell us. Over to you, Mauricio.
Thank you so much. So today we'll be giving an overview of the Canadian aftermarket sector. We'll be discussing and providing some analysis on the demand and also the trends that are affecting the auto care industry, which would also include comparing the Canadian market to other jurisdictions. So very excited to be here to be walking you through the key aspects of the study. If we move to the next slide. So in this part of the webinar, we'll be discussing the health of the aftermarket sector, and we're going to be focusing on key macro data, in this case, looking at GDP, employment, and demand for products and services. So what you see here is on the left-hand side, that GDP for the aftermarket sector in Canada, that post-pandemic, the sector has shown consistent growth, reaching almost 40 billion in 2023, which represents 2.6% increase from 2022. So despite the economic shock from the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing economic uncertainty over the past 2 years, the automotive sector has been robust and resilient, and it continues to expand, demonstrating its strength and adaptability. If we shift to the right-hand side of the slide, we can observe changes in GDP at the industry level. So for example, we see in 2023, growth in the sector was driven by core aftermarket segments, which saw an approximate almost 6% increase during this year. But more importantly, this growth was driven by the motor vehicle parts manufacturing segment, which has seen strong growth between 2021 and 2023. But on the other hand, we see the non-core aftermarket output shrink, with industries in the subsector posting 2023 GDP approximately 3% lower than in 2022. So this performance aligns with the broader Canadian economy, where key areas such as warehouse clubs, supercenters, and other general merchandise stores were affected by the economic uncertainty and the elevated interest rates at that time. These trends highlight the varying performance within the aftermarket sector, with core segments showing significant growth, while non-core segments face challenges similar to the broader economy. If we move forward. So here we'll be discussing the implications of consumer expectations and inflation impacts to the broader automotive sector. And the key takeaway here is that while inflation in Canada has eased since 2022, consumer inflation expectations remain elevated, leading to reduced spending. So for instance, during 2023 and 2024, price pressures eased considerably. We saw inflation come down from a high of 7.6% during the second quarter of 2022 to downwards of 2% as of December of this past year. This easing of inflationary pressures prompted the Bank of Canada to implement aggressive reductions in the policy rate, now reaching 3.25% we see as of December 2024. Lower inflation expectations coupled with declining interest rates are expected to further ease the financial burden on households and likely support increased economic activity. So although business activity in the automotive aftermarket is largely considered non-discretionary, easing inflation and growing real wages may support the sector by decreasing the prevalence of delayed maintenance. On the right-hand side of this slide, we have the industrial PPI measure, or the Industrial Product Price Index. The IPPI measure price changes for major automotive parts sold by manufacturers operating in Canada. So although this index does not perfectly capture the prices paid by aftermarket companies that rely on foreign suppliers, it is a reasonable proxy to reflect the movements in prices. So after steady price increases for major automotive parts in 2021 and 2023, growth rates slowed down across the board in early 2023. So this stabilization is due to easing supply chain challenges and an improving economic outlook. But what we've seen in the first 2 quarters of 2024, the cost for input components and goods have remained quite stable with little volatility. This stability has contributed to profitability by allowing the sector to have more predictable expenses and likely to expect more stable profit margins. We move on to the next slide. So moving on here, we see that the aftermarket employment and job growth showed strong recovery in 2022, followed by a slight decline in 2023. So for example, in 2022, the aftermarket sector saw significant employment growth, adding over 26,000 jobs compared to 2021 and reaching pre-pandemic levels. This increase was largely driven by the non-core aftermarket, which contributed around 48.4% of the new jobs. However, in 2023, the aftermarket sector experienced a slight employment decline, losing about 1,700 jobs. Now, this drop was driven by a 4% contraction in the non-core aftermarket, as we've seen in the previous slides. But on the other hand, the core aftermarket saw strong growth with rising employment rising above 3%. So when looking at aftermarket technicians, shown on the right-hand side here, 2023 saw a significant rebound, with employment growing nearly 30% annually after a 6.3% decline in 2022. So this trend does continue into 2024 with strong growth in the first half of the year. And we're seeing as investments in skill development and training are also supporting this growing demand. If we move on.
Right, thank you, Mauricio, for presenting those slides. I hear lots of positive growth for our industry. We are a resilient industry, no doubt. I want to start off with, so we're going to do a mini Q&A to see what these results mean for the industry. And we're going to do that for the other following segments. I want to start off with the top of mind question. We've all been thinking Trump, tariffs, US-Canada merger, Canada as a 51st state, our Prime Minister Trudeau stepping down, lots of political changes. How is this going to impact the positive growth that we are finally witnessing after COVID-19? And Mauricio, maybe you could start with unpacking some of that.
Of course, yeah, very happy to do so. And it's a very great question, and it's a very complicated situation at the moment. We see not only from a geopolitical perspective, both in the US, but also in Canada, when we think about supply chains, I mean, they're very highly integrated between both countries, especially when it comes to the manufacturing of automotive components. So more generally around these times of uncertainty from both a macro perspective and geopolitical uncertainty, you see capital deployment often being quite delayed or even canceled by businesses. And more so, sometimes we also observe that it's being allocated elsewhere within their operations of their business, or they actually deployed until this uncertainty clears. Now, in terms of the geopolitical issues in Canada, that will be cleared quite soon, but we're still very unsure as to what may arise from the potential tariffs. So as a result, we have seen business investment decline during this period, and we do anticipate this to be no different.
Thank you, Mauricio. So just moving on to Todd, to bring in a US perspective, you have finally given us Trump to the world. So maybe you can tell us how to deal with the situation now.
Oh, I wish I could, Samshia. Yes, we've brought you Trump 2.0, but I think on our side of the border, I think we're equally as confused as to what the actual outcome is going to be. We've heard a lot of rhetoric, a lot of conversation about what he plans to do as far as tariffs go. And yes, as you said, Canada as a 51st state and buying Greenland and the Panama Canal and uh, it we too are challenged with separating the truth from the noise. One thing we know about Trump from his first time in office and the subsequent time since then, even before his inauguration here in about a week, is that he does like to talk and he does say a lot of things. Um, the truth is usually in there, um, but sometimes there's things that are done or said for effect as well, and there's a middle ground that is reached. And so I think, like Mauricio said, I think we're in kind of that wait and see right now. From a personal budget standpoint for consumers and from a corporate standpoint as to should we spend money, should we make these investments or not? I think when there's unknowns, there's certainly a wait and see, and I think that's where we're kind of sitting right now. So hopefully, as those things start to clear up, we'll start to see the benefit of really, as Mauricio just went through, some very positive signals for the aftermarket in the coming years.
Thank you. Moving on to JF, what sense are you getting from our members?
Yeah, so what our members are telling us is, the industry has proven to be resilient. There are great indicators of growth. But again, in light of what we're seeing happening in the US, concerns around predictability, because in order for the members to continue to invest and grow the businesses, they really need to understand a bit what's ahead of them, good or bad. And while we often say that turbulence in the market provides opportunities, again, what you're looking for in order to guide your business is some level of predictability into the future. And this is, unfortunately, the circumstances we're facing right now, the beginning of 2025, is where we're getting members to be very prudent, and where before they might have been a little bit more bullish in investing or reinvesting into businesses. I think what we're going to see a bit of a hold and see type of position, at least probably for the first half of the year or so. And looking into the US perspective of the new administrations, we know that the Trump administration is going to have essentially control of the House, both the House, the Senate, and the presidencies in the hands of the Republicans. And that's going to be true for the next 2 years. And so I think we're going to see a lot of activities and a bit of a turbulence coming from the US, at least for that period of time, for sure.
Well, thank you, Jeff. What I'm hearing is wait and see and need for predictability. So hopefully, fingers crossed that that's something that we see at least in the beginning, the first half of the year. Moving along to our next segment, Mauricio.
Thank you so much. Yes, on this section, we'll be now focused on the aftermarket sector demand analysis. We'll be thinking about it from a Canadian perspective and then doing a little bit deeper dive on the revenue piece. If we just move to the next slide, perfect. So here we just showcase this data that was provided by INRIX that shows Canadian travel patterns. So as an example, this data, it provides trends or trip trends, and it's an index to showcase track vehicle movement metrics against pre-pandemic levels, which helps us, it really helps us understand travel patterns during and after COVID-19. So for instance, on the left-hand side, we see that that GPS data shows quarterly travel distance, this indice, and it's illustrating travel dynamics during the pandemic and post-pandemic recovery. So in 2021, for example, low vehicle travel is largely due to COVID-19 lockdowns and travel restrictions. But then we saw travel recovered in 2022 as restriction eased. But then as of 2023, travel distance actually decreased, with Q3 2023 being over 30% lower than in Q3 of 2022. So what we observed is, well, why was this declining? Well, we tend to see that from an economics perspective, we've seen rising fueling costs, inflation, and the prevalence of remote or hybrid work may be contributing to reduced travel distances compared to what we have observed in the pre-pandemic levels. If we move on to the next slide. Here we see delayed maintenance behavior remains prevalent amongst Canadians, with about a third citing high repair costs as a primary reason. So for example, in 2023, the share of Canadian car owners using garages and shops for maintenance stayed steady from 2021, with dealerships being as their second choice. Consumers tend to prioritize recommendations, price, and even convenience when choosing between chain and independent shops. The sector continues to see car owners delaying maintenance and repairs, especially during times of prevalent economic uncertainty. So when asked about the reasons for delaying maintenance, car owners often mention perceived costs, lack of expertise, and time constraints as top reasons. On the right-hand side of this slide, we see an overview of the average replacement rate for a selection of popular replacement parts. So here we see replacement rates measured as a percentage of vehicles that have had relevant part replaced or serviced during that same year. By far, we see oil changes and oil filters have the highest replacement rates, followed by other popular parts such as air filters, wiper blades, and windshield wiper fluid. We're seeing that attitude towards part replacements tend to change also with the age of vehicles. So both new and experienced car owners delay maintenance, but actually for different reasons. So for instance, new vehicle owners tend to delay maintenance due to high part costs and typically continue using dealership services. But on the other hand, older vehicle owners delay non-essential repairs, as these are often not crucial to the car's drivability, whether it's perceived or actual. We move on to the next slide here. So moving on here, we see the core aftermarket sector revenues grow by close to 16% in 2022, driven by automotive repair and maintenance. So here, revenues of the core aftermarket industry totaled just over 35 billion in 2022, up nearly that 16% to 31 billion in 2021. The automotive repair and maintenance industry made up over almost 2/3 of the sector's total revenues. And interestingly, smaller businesses outperformed larger ones when comparing their profit margins in 2022. Financial performance greatly improved from 2020, aligning with GDP growth over the past few years. And given the economic uncertainty and high interest rates that the economy is subject to, including for companies and firms operating in the automotive aftermarket, financial performance for the sector in 2023 and 24 may be in line with that of the broader economy, potentially seeing a slower period of growth. We now move to the next section.
Thanks, Mauricio. So now we'll zoom out and take a macro look at the vehicle fleet that is underlying all the aftermarket detail that Mauricio has covered so far. And to start with, I would say that the aftermarket fleet, or the vehicle fleet, I should say, in the Canadian marketplace is very healthy at just over 25 million units on the road in Canada as of the start of 2023. Relatively, we've been flat since 2020. While we are flat, we are seeing some shifts in the consumer preference as far as fuel types and vehicle types and other things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into future slides. And we are seeing some impact of exports going into the US market that is kind of working as a headwind to the overall vehicle fleet in the Canadian marketplace. But that said, in light of the combination of those things, we're still seeing some good aftermarket growth that Mauricio already talked about. So in general, I think that the vehicle fleet is poised in Canada to provide continued ongoing aftermarket opportunity in the coming years. We're seeing good pipeline coming in, as you can see there in the middle of this slide. We're back to normal, maybe even a little bit of growth from prior years in new vehicle registration. So the pipeline of vehicles coming into the marketplace is back to pre-pandemic levels at about 1.6 million units in 2023. 2024 looks to likely be very similar. We don't have final numbers on 2024 yet available, but both years are expected to be better than what we saw in 2022, which again, the cool thing about the aftermarket is, number one, its resilience. Number two is factors such as new registrations do take a while to build into the aftermarket, and the effects of even the downturn in new vehicle registration in 2022 in the light of the total vehicle fleet, is expected to have minimal impact going forward. I think we saw some very positive forecast numbers for the aftermarket that Mauricio already shared. And I expect from a vehicle fleet perspective that we'll be able to support that, even in light of some of the geopolitical things that we've talked about. One of the reasons for that is that we're seeing average age continuing to sustain at a relatively positive level for the aftermarket, really, at 10 and a half years of age. The average vehicle in the Canadian marketplace sits right in that sweet spot of still having very good residual value and very good life left, while still being outside of that typical warranty period where the new owner typically goes back to the OE dealership for repairs during that warranty period. At an average of 10 and a half years, those vehicles are squarely in the aftermarket space. Just as a sake of comparison, this is slightly lower than the US market. The US market is over 12 and a half years of age on average. It could be a combination of things that we could talk about, certainly. But in general, at 10 and a half, we're still in a very positive average age range for the Canadian aftermarket. We are seeing some changes in there. Consumer preference in general has shifted from passenger cars to light trucks, and we're seeing that happen really across North America as consumers continue to move to the crossover utility vehicles from the traditional sedans and things like that. So a lot of those changes still have opportunity to change the sorts of repairs that the aftermarket will see in the coming years. But in general, from a macro level, I think it's very positive for the general health of the Canadian marketplace. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide. Just to kind of show you in pictures where we've been over the past 4 or 5 years. It's news to no one on the call that we suffered through a pandemic and supply chain challenges. And you can see there that the overall volume of vehicles in operation in Canada grew up through 2021, and then it started to pull back in 2022, and we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery in 2023. But really, we're talking about very, very small volumes here. You can see it's very close to 25 million from 2019 through 2023, and growing in 2024 moderately from there. A couple things are happening inside these small shifts in the vehicle fleet over the past 5 years. Obviously, we dealt with the pandemic and the supply chain. From 2021 to 2022, we saw that reduction in VIO for a couple reasons. One was it was just hard to get and register new vehicles. Another was the nature of our vehicles in operation is that we need registrations to occur to track these vehicles. And so we had a little bit of a delay there as well. But the third factor, and I think the factor that most impacts the Canadian aftermarket, is that we also saw increase in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar. So the US dollar got stronger during that time period, and it's continued to be relatively strong. And one of the nuances we see in the North American vehicle fleet is when the US dollar reaches a certain point in exchange rate with the Canadian dollar, we see an increase in the export of vehicles from Canada into the US. Now, there is the potential that that reverts and changes back, but it really travels with the rate of exchange between the two dollars. And during 2022, 2023, and even now through 2024 and into 2025, the US dollar remains pretty strong. And so we're seeing vehicles being exported at a higher rate than normal from Canada into the US. It is down over 2022 because we also had the constraint of new and used vehicles across North America. And so with a high US dollar and a low volume of vehicles available, we actually saw more vehicles coming into the US because US consumers had a strong dollar and they were willing to pay even more top dollar to get a new used vehicle. And so we're through a lot of those things. We still do have a strong US dollar, which is going to continue to cause exports into the US market, but we're beginning to see that move back towards normal. But I think the key for this audience to be aware of is that as we've seen that increase in vehicles going to the US, the vehicles that leave the US typically are in that aftermarket space. They're post-warranty. It used to be an average of around 10 years. It's gone down a little bit since the supply chain crisis, and it's starting to regress back towards that not $10, 10-year-old vehicle that is exporting into the US. But right now it's below that a little bit. And so that will have implications in the inventory management and in the inventory planning for aftermarket organizations in Canada. So it's always good to monitor the flow of those vehicles going across into the US and let that inform the way you manage your inventory for the Canadian marketplace as well. We can hop to the next slide. So in general, I talked a little bit about this. We're seeing new registration continue, and this is a long-term trend at this point. This has really been happening for the past, I'd say, decade or a little bit more, coming out of what was the financial crisis of 2009, 10, and 11. We saw a decided preference moving towards light trucks. And really, that really is the advent of the crossover utility vehicle. Years ago, it was the station wagon was the vehicle of choice for families. In the 90s, it shifted to the minivan. Late 90s, early 2000s, we shifted to the SUV. During the financial crisis, it shifted back towards cars. But since then, it's shifted towards this crossover utility vehicle. And now we've seen entrants in that space from the subcompact all the way up to full-size SUVs. And that's really what's driving this change here. But this will change, obviously, the vehicles that are coming in. You do see more all-wheel drive vehicles. You see more turbocharged vehicles. You see more efficient CUVs. But this is certainly the across North America. And even though we haven't talked much about the rest of the world, we're also seeing this in Europe to a lesser degree, that crossover utility vehicles are becoming interesting to consumers. So we expect this trend to continue until the next new cool vehicle type comes into play, which for the foreseeable future, we think is the crossover. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide. As I alluded to, we're seeing cars. Two things are happening to cars. Number one, their overall share in the vehicle fleet is dropping rapidly. You can see in 2023, they dropped below 10 million for the first time in a quite substantial amount of time. Actually, we show back through 2019 there. But in general, the passenger car is aging rapidly because its share of the fleet is shrinking rapidly. Essentially, right now, the car body style is not having enough new registrations enter the fleet to sustain the volume or the age. And so we're seeing a rapid increase in average age for passenger cars as compared to the rest of the fleet. But I would temper your interest and concern there, because really what we're seeing is an equilibrium. So as the fleet shrinks to more accurately represent the new vehicles coming into the marketplace from a share perspective, we'll see that average age for passenger cars level out as well. And so this is kind of a normal ebb and flow of the vehicle fleet that we're dealing with right now. But you certainly, I would imagine, are seeing different vehicles coming into your bays than you did probably 10 years ago from a mix standpoint. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. So we're also seeing the advent of the electric vehicle in the Canadian marketplace. Obviously in the world, there's lots of press about electric vehicle coming into the vehicle fleet. And as you can see, there has been rapid growth. To a degree, the news is certainly justified because, we've seen since 2019, it's gone from under 200,000 to over 600,000 vehicles in the fleet. Very respectable growth in the overall fleet for the electric vehicle. This is an interesting comparison between the Canadian market and the US market. And it's not here on the slide, but the US market, we're seeing similar growth, but we're seeing headwinds emerge more rapidly in the US market. I think the Canadian market, we've seen, obviously there's been a little headwinds as we've been dealing with inflation and other factors over the past couple years, but the growth in the EV fleet in Canada seems to be a little bit more sustained than what we've seen south of the border, especially in places like Quebec, in British Columbia, Vancouver area. I know there's some things, and we might get into this later, with the tax incentives and things like that that could be going away. But right now, the EV market in Canada actually seems like it's maybe a little bit stronger than the US. And if you go ahead and jump to the next slide, that does inform our forecasted share of new registrations for electric vehicles going out through 2030. This is our March 2024 forecast that you're seeing here on the screen right now. You can see for 2024, we were under 20%. I believe we may be a little bit below there right now because, as I said, this was at the start of 2024. And across 2024, we saw some additional headwinds emerge for electric vehicle share. But this is certainly something to monitor. In 2030, we expect it to be over 60%. I would say, again, we may see that whole line shift down as we're starting to see some of the things that we talked about earlier in the webinar, the wait and see that we're seeing in consumers and business investments. We've definitely seen a little bit more caution around investing in new technologies and electric vehicles over the back half of 2024. And then obviously the Trump effect that we already talked about a little bit, and the Trudeau effect as well, I guess in Canada. It's different, but similar. There's that unknown that we're going to begin to deal with. And so that may cause this whole line to be pulled down a little bit. And it might be interesting to get into this a little bit more with the rest of the group in a few minutes. But I think the electric vehicles are coming into the marketplace. And I think they will be a component of the fleet that we're going to be expected to maintain going forward, whether it's at 60% by 2030 or a smaller number or a larger number. The aftermarket, as we already noted in this webinar, does prove to be resilient. And so I think this is another area where we'll have to prove our mettle and our resilience in sustaining these vehicles in the future. Samsha.
Thank you, Todd, for deep diving into this. I want to tap into JF to potentially address two things. Firstly would be industry preparedness for EVs, and second would be the rebate situation, because we've seen some changes at the federal level when it comes to EV rebates. So Jeff, maybe you could start off with what you're hearing from our members and what you're noticing from our members in terms of EV preparedness.
Sure, absolutely. Well, the reality is that we're seeing a growing number of EVs on the road that are getting in that sweet spot of age of vehicle that are serviced in the automotive aftermarket. But it is really I would say, a regional type of phenomenon. So where we've seen great support and policy by government to accelerate the adoption of EVs, namely in British Columbia and in Quebec, we've seen obviously the park grow. And as a result of that, the market has started to adapt in providing those customized services and offering different line of products. So there is this adaptations of the market that is, again, very much resilient, adapting to the changing reality. Now, again, those are very visible in market like Vancouver or Montreal, but it has been linked to policy programs from government. And as you just mentioned, Shamsia, we just saw recently the announcement that the federal incentive is now going to be paused. That just followed the announcement that the Quebec government is also pausing their program to subsidize the purchase of a new EV. And overall, a change in policy coming with the likelihood of a change of government, where a conservative government is less likely to continue to support these type of initiatives long term. So as Todd was indicating, we're seeing the growth. How fast this acceleration will continue, I think it's going to start to level off a bit. But the fact is, with more EVs, it will continue to be, in some market, a material percentage of the fleet. And I think this is going to start to expand to other markets as well. And so we're very much going to see, in the next 5 years, I believe, a growing number of members who are now making these investments to provide a custom solutions specifically to EVs. But I would not necessarily discount a shift in the transitions also to a greater number of hybrid vehicle. The plug-in hybrid and hybrid vehicle seems to really address the sweet spot of providing convenience and reducing emission. So I think we're going to also see more of that. And again, whether it's hybrid or EVs, these two type of technology will definitely provide opportunities for the aftermarket.
Thank you, JF, for that. Todd, Mauricio, anything further to add to what JF mentioned?
No, I mean, I think a lot of it's been covered now, and yeah, it's what's remained to be seen.
So I'm going to pose an open-ended question here. So do you think we'll see EVs stand on their own 2 feet without rebates at some point and still continue to perform the way they have been performing?
So I'll start on that one. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a good time to ask that question. We experienced this in the US in a couple different markets over the years, where when rebates were pulled back, the EV new registration suffered, and not just a little. It's not like it plateaued or it came down. It came down substantially. But I think in markets, especially like what we've seen in Quebec and maybe to a slightly lesser extent BC, because I feel like BC might be slightly behind from an adoption standpoint. But I think at some point the government does have to pull that incentive back and ask the question of the market of, does this stand on its own 2 feet yet? Especially when you consider the consumers that are the typical EV consumers. Typically, they're more wealthy households that if they want to buy an EV, they could probably do it without the incentive anyways. And so, I think especially with the move towards conservative governments in, let's just say across US and Canada both, I think that question is probably going to be asked in the next couple of years, as JF was alluding to, especially here in the US, where we have maybe not a mandate, but we definitely have conservative control of the executive and legislative branches.
Yeah. Maybe I'll add to this, Todd. You're right. There are definitely use cases for a family living in the suburbs looking for a secondary vehicle that is not going to be their primary vehicle for short distance travel, where they could plug in the vehicle at home. This is a great use case for EVs. And so that will continue to grow. And to your point, Todd, there are likely to be families that could afford the price difference that you see in EVs. And it probably talks to the early adopters. I don't know, a third of the population that says, I'm excited about EVs. I have the financial means of buying the EV. I've got the facility to plug it in at home. And so those are going to be still true. And I think very much served by the wide growing variety of EVs being provided and made available by automakers. I'd say the second third of the population is one that says, if and when EVs become comparably cost-effective against ICE vehicle, they'll make that choice naturally simply because it's a better economic choice. And it's yet to be seen if and when we're in fact going to take to a place where EVs production costs will come down enough to be competitive against ICE vehicle. And I would say there's the last third of the population. I will say, I love ICE vehicle that gives me the convenience of long distance. I have requirements to, pull a boat, an RV. I live in remote areas. The availability of the charging infrastructures is not there. And those will be a hard third to convince to move to an EV. So if you look at those 3/3 of the population, there's still a material amount of the population, I think, that will find EVs to be a good choice and will continue to buy those even in the absence of rebate. But we'll certainly not get to the 100% of EV sales or zero emission vehicle that the government seeks to get to by 2035.
Great, thank you for those insights, JF, Todd, and Mauricio. I believe you are now going into the third segment. We have benchmarking analysis followed by trends, and Mauricio, you're going to be tackling this.
Thank you so much, Shamsia. And yes, very exciting. I mean, it's always interesting to know and how the Canadian aftermarket compares with other global jurisdictions. And so in this section, we'll be presenting comparing the key economic and sectoral indicators and what that means for AIA. We move on to the next slide here. So continuing from the analysis that we have conducted in the past, we kept track of several different indicators to gauge how Canada and factors affecting performance in the automotive aftermarket have performed in comparison to other major economies. So in this case, in 2023, we see that the US has had the highest real GDP growth at about 2.5%, while we see Australia's GDP actually contract by 0.1%, whereas we see can actually grow at about almost 4 in 2021 and 1.2 in 2022. The US aftermarket has led this sector, representing almost 3% of its total GDP in 2023, and we see Canada at 2%, whereas we see the UK at 1.5 and Australia at 1.2. So really, and also to add that we see the Canada's aftermarket share of GDP decline by about 0.1 percentage point from 2021. So we do note that the limited transportation options and urban sprawls in the US and Canada have really emphasized vehicle ownership. We're seeing this really boost the aftermarket GDP in 2023. And we have seen that in Canada has been led in transport operation expenditures at about 7.1% of household spending. Whereas we see in the UK, it lands around 5.6%. The US is very similar, and Australia trailing behind at about less than 5%. What we will add here as well is in the US aftermarket, it has employed almost 4% of their national workforce. But in Canada, we also see it's actually closer to 3%, and Australia about 2.5%, and UK about 2%. So the aftermarket employment has declined from 2021, partly due to ongoing economic uncertainty, and as we discussed, the rising costs for companies and firms in this sector. If we move on to the next slide here. Here we see vehicle registrations and kilometers driven per vehicle as key indicators of sector demand across jurisdictions. In 2023, we see that the US has led vehicle registrations with about 892 per thousand, followed by Australia at 813 and Canada slightly lower at 739 and UK at 660. So we have seen that registrations have actually increased across all 4 jurisdictions since 2020. We have also noted that the US's higher registration rate, which is about 21% above Canada, may reflect greater vehicle dependence and higher disposable income. On the right-hand side of the slide, we see total vehicle kilometers traveled across jurisdictions. So in 2022, the UK and Canada have had the most vehicles kilometers traveled relative to 2020, with Canada showing the greatest recovery from 2021 as we saw the restrictions ease from COVID. If we shift to the next slide. So here we have to new vehicle sales, and in 2023, the US led this with about 47.1% new vehicles per thousand, and whereas Canada is just slightly behind at 46.2, Australia 45, and lastly with the UK at 33.6. So we see that the UK has had the highest growth in new vehicles, which is actually almost closer to 20%. Whereas we see Canada has had the lowest at about 11.6. So interestingly, what we've seen, and we had a great discussion on EVs, it has significantly contributed to new vehicle sales growth, making up about 20% of the sales in the UK. This growth was driven by the implementation of what we saw as a national zero emissions mandate. And we saw in Australia that EV sales grew by about over 100%, so about 121, but they still remain the lowest in the adoption when compared to other jurisdictions in our sample. So we're seeing that slow uptake in Australia. But in Canada and the US, we saw the growth of EV sales from 31.5% and 25% respectively, really showcasing the increased adoption and a growing number of customers who are more willing to consider EVs as their next vehicle. And now if we just move forward, here we're just going to be shifting towards trends affecting the automotive aftermarket industry. So if we just move forward here, as mentioned in the jurisdictional scan, and we've had this great discussion that EVs and EV adoption are ongoing trends for the automotive sector worldwide, and these will be affecting the future of the aftermarket sector. So here at EY, we have a mobility consumer index study, which really just tracks consumer behaviors. And what we've seen is that the EV market penetration in Canada doubled between 2021 and 2023. And there was an interest in purchasing EVs has also surged, with 42% of Canadians planning to buy a vehicle in the next 24 months and 52% of them considering an EV. We also see that while a decline in overall vehicle purchase to intent from 46% down to 42% in 2023, EV demand continues to rise. So this trend does suggest a growing need for EV aftermarket services, which may be required in the short and medium term, really necessitating investments in specialized equipment and staff training. Todd, I'd love to hear your thoughts or if you have any additional context here.
Yeah, I think that's great, Mauricio. I think I think really I think JF touched on it earlier that they're here. I think they're going to have some headwinds going forward. That third that you said, JF, I think is right on point. That I think we're nearing a third of the marketplace, and maybe 42 is a little over a third with intent to buy. Not all intenders do end up buying, but I think that really is the case, and I think that's really what we, when you peel back all the rhetoric, I think that's where we need to get to from an aftermarket perspective is, could we see growth towards that third in the near term? Yeah, I think so. Is the next third possible? Probably, but that's longer term. That third is going to be really difficult. And when you kind of set the stage pragmatically, I think, in general, we would agree with a lot of these numbers. We believe that there is growth for EV on the horizon, but I do think, as we've talked about a little bit already in this webinar, we are facing really the first period since the EV really came to the marketplace. I think the next couple of years we're going to face the first period of what we call the trough of disillusionment at S&P Global. So if you think about it, it's not quite a bell curve. If you think of adoption as a bell curve, that's not what we see. We see people really excited. Now we've seen rhetoric and the news cycle and everything start to turn a little bit negative. We've gotten past those early adopters, and we're getting into that trough where, inflation was hard the past couple of years. We're coming out of that, but now we're entering this time of uncertainty around geopolitical factors, and investment in business and things like that. And I think we're kind of going to be in that trough for the next few years, and it'll be interesting to see how that first third that JF mentioned earlier, the ones who can do it, are curious about it, and are open to it, how they really respond in the next couple of years. Because I think that will be telling as to how long it takes us to see a greater share of new registrations over the long run.
Great, thank you, Todd. If we just move to the next slide here, we'll be talking about software-defined vehicles and the market growth. And maybe before I jump in, just very quickly, we all know, but I mean, when we think about SDVs, it's just really cars that really heavily rely on that software to control their function. So it can be something as simple as from driving all the way to their entertainment systems. And here we're seeing that the SDV market in Canada is projected to grow annually by about 24%. So it's really reaching over about 10 billion by 2028. So this growth is driven by increasing vehicle autonomy and the rapid integration of sophisticated electronics and communication systems that are now being built into these vehicles. Given the growing market for SDVs, we're seeing several key services that may be required to support the vehicle repair and maintenance, as you'll see presented on the right-hand side of this slide. So these services are expected to become more prevalent in the aftermarket as the SDV market grows, and this will require proficiencies in a whole new skills that we haven't seen in the past. So this may include things around telematics and predictive maintenance. It can be something around cybersecurity, software integration, I mean, advanced diagnostics. I mean, there's many that we really have to consider now with the growth in the SDV market. And saying that, this is where we'll conclude. And Shamsia, over to you.
Thank you, Mauricio. My question is regarding the software-defined. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A to close off this webinar. So for the software-defined vehicles, JF, I'm going to pick your brain to see how we could situate this conversation amongst the right to repair movement, the campaign. So we saw the passing of Bill C 244, and what does this mean for the industry and for the movement?
Yeah, thank you, Shamsia. I'm hoping you've been following our great government relations activity at AIA and the passing of Bill C-244, a big success and something we've been working on at AIA for a long time. C-244 essentially has changed the Copyright Act in Canada in allowing for the breaking of TPM, technological protection measures, essentially software locks. So you are now able to not contradict the Copyright Act by taking actions to break those software locks that are increasingly finding themselves into vehicle or other goods, in fact. And so this is one small step, because as you get a car that is increasingly more driven by software, the need for technology in order to do regular maintenance and repair is just simply going to grow. And we're already seeing it in newer models being put on the road. So C-244 is one solid step in that direction, but falls short of a wide-ranging right to repair legislation that would compel automakers to make all that information available and create a competitive marketplace for everyone in the aftermarket. So the question remains whole as to whether or not, in fact, when we think about software-defined vehicle, over-the-air updates, integrations of systems on board, as whether or not, in fact, we are going to be able to access these systems, or they will remain to be under the control of automakers and their authorized networks. And so we really hope that we're going to continue to be successful in accessing those systems. But today it's hard to tell exactly where we're going to land in regards to right to repair legislations.
Thank you, JF. Todd, do you have anything to add on the SDVs?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would just add to JF's comments, one of the things that we do in our team that is researching telematics connectivity and SDV is we track the why. Like, what is the eventual goal of the manufacturers in putting all this technology in? And part of it is for the consumers. It's cool, it's safety, it makes the vehicle safer, better, more fun to drive. But part of it is commercialization. You know, they're taking that data and finding ways to make money on it, whether it's serving offers up to you, whether it's driving you back to their dealerships, trying to track you to when you're next ready to buy a new vehicle, that you stay loyal to their brand. Like, there's a lot. And they're also dabbling in, you know, insurance, at least in US they are. I'm sure they probably are in Canada as well, dabbling in insurance and other things they can commercialize, and maybe even ways they can sell some of that data. But one of the things that is interesting that we track is that to date, those connections, when you think about the connected vehicle, the OE only keeps those connections live for so long. Historically, it's been 7, 8, 9 years at the most, and then they don't pay to keep that technology going. It's a technology limitation. They started with 3G. It's costly to keep 3G, 4G, and 5G going. So a lot of those early connected vehicles, they haven't paid to maintain. Their philosophy and outlook is changing, and they're moving towards 10, 12, 15 years. But I still think it's an interesting conundrum for the aftermarket as these vehicles are released new as connected, but are they going to stay connected, air quotes connected, for their whole life? And I think that creates an opportunity for the aftermarket, maybe to pick up those connections, maybe to create different services. But the absolute key, and I think JF talked about it a little bit already, is that we have to have access to even know how those connections work and how we could keep those going in an aftermarket perspective. So, you know, for me, when I talk to my OE side researchers about this, that's the biggest point that I raise, is that's really interesting that they don't keep the connection live forever. But how do we service those vehicles in the aftermarket? Because we know their life cycle is longer than the OE is looking to keep that connection live today, at least. So lots of interesting opportunities, but the criticality of having that right to repair legislation, I don't think can be overstated for the consumer or for our marketplace, to be honest.
That's an important point, Todd. Thank you for pointing that out. And Jeff, thank you for your comments as well. I'm just going to change gears a little bit here and touch upon labor, which we haven't had a chance to discuss, but there's tons of more information in the Outlook study itself. One point I want to pull from the Outlook study is that there hasn't been real wage growth. It was offset by inflationary pressures. And Mauricio, I just want to quickly have you comment. I'm mindful of the time. Have you comment on what does this mean for an industry that is riddled with labor shortages?
Great question. And I mean, if we just start from the very beginning, from first principles, I mean, when you see wage growth is offset by inflation, it really just means that people are earning more, and their increased earnings don't go as far because the cost of living has also gone up, though. So, right, those are the 1, 2 things you have to think about. But for this sector, we have seen that labor shortage issue arise, but what it may mean is it's going to make it harder to attract and even retain workers, right? So meaning that employees that may look for higher paying jobs might just go elsewhere or leave that industry altogether. We have seen this, multiple times. So really to address this, it is around the discussions we've been having with AIA around having the working conditions to maintain pods, to stay competitive, to be able to improve certain parts of that, to help really attract that new generation to be able to help and actually repair these new cars that will be coming into the market. We've seen the rise of EVs, and really, how's the diagnosis? How do you repair this? Right now, we're thinking about replacements, and is that really the answer? So I think there's a lot of excitement in this sector altogether, and we can really play to that to help grow this.
Awesome. Thank you, Mauricio. So I'm going to close off the Q&A with a question that I'm going to pose to all three of you. We've had this information that we have delved into the past hour. JF, maybe I could put you on the spot and start with you. If you could highlight one opportunity and one challenge on how to overcome that challenge for a business that is operating in the automotive auto care space.
Sure, it's making it sound a little self-serving, Shamsia, but for anyone that is engaged in the automotive aftermarket, their best tool probably for them, the best opportunity is the engagement in the community. And what I mean by the community is their association. There are a few of us, obviously, that are representing the automotive aftermarket here in the United States. We're all collaborating all together, but it's very important that we stay engaged and connected with our respective associations, because that's the way to stay informed. We've talked about coming into time of uncertainty, so information is key, but also the importance of being able to have good advocate on behalf of the industry. That's the role of the association, is to push forward recommendations, advocacy, informations to government bodies to influence policy that will ultimately really influence whether or not, in fact, we're going to be able to service the cars of today and tomorrow. And so I think that's going to be the best opportunity we have moving forward. And in terms of challenges, obviously, it's going to be stay abreast of all the changes that are coming. There's a bit of headwind coming our way. And so that's something that people needs to be aware, and obviously being able to respond to accordingly.
Awesome. As AIA staff, I could get behind that, Jeff. All right, Todd, same question to you.
So I tend to agree on the opportunity front. It's being a part of the group and staying connected. I think the OEs, when you look at the size and the strength of the OE and their lobby with governments, really globally, it's really difficult to go at it your own. And so being a part of what AIA is doing, and being informed with the challenges and the needs for things like, right to repair and helping with those things, I think is a great opportunity. I think for challenge, a lot of folks want to say that electric vehicles are a challenge. I don't think that's a huge challenge, because I think there will be opportunities to repair them. But I think the challenge really is, it always goes back to the basics of having the right part at the right place at the right time to make that repair, and balancing that customer expectation with managing your inventory efficiently. I think the proliferation that we've seen over the past decade is probably going to continue and maybe get worse, because now we've got powertrain proliferation as well. And we already talked about plug-in hybrid, ICE, battery electric vehicle, fuel cell. And so managing that inventory and not having too big of a number on your balance sheet while still serving the customer, I think is a huge challenge for everybody in our industry.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd. Mauricio?
Uh, So I will say that the challenge will be the opportunity is the way I'd phrase it, meaning that we're seeing industries are transforming quickly all across. It's not just the aftermarket automotive industry, it's everywhere. This digitalization is occurring. So we're seeing it right now as STVs, we're seeing it through EVs. How do you repair this? So that in itself, that is something that is coming through the pipeline. And we have to be very, very on top of that. And so what is that? Then that's a challenge because everyone will be fighting for that same person on the labor side. On the capital front is that's where I get excited on the opportunities. So the innovation. So it's really staying connected, not only to your members, but also to other organizations, research institutions, staying on top of where that can be, have that edge, so to speak. And we're seeing this globally, right? I mean, and I'd like to speak in more macro-based purposes, but this is where we're really observing this, that it's not just the aftermarket automotive. Everyone's thinking like this. We have to think more broadly and say, well, what is working in another sector that is very similar to us in terms of capital intensity, human capital, in terms of the transformation, and what are they using? What are they doing? And so you can now break this question up or this challenge or this opportunity into two dimensions. One is around what are other sectors doing globally? And also, what is it that the aftermarket automotive market is also doing globally? So you have two fronts, comparing yourself to other industries, but also to seeing what they're doing elsewhere. So maybe it's a roundabout answer to say that if you stay up top of current innovations and top of current trends, I think that will present an opportunity from this challenge.
Thank you, Mauricio. And I want to thank JF Todd also for taking the time out to share your expertise. Thank you for tuning in to our audiences into this webinar. We hope you found this useful. There's a lot more information and data where this came from. Go download the Outlook Study, the data visualization tool. It's all available on AIA's website, especially if you are a member. If you're not, then please do contact us and we'll see what we can do. JF, Todd, Mauricio, thank you so much. And we look forward to having you at another one of our webinars here at AIA.